At night, Peppa opened her eyes. The house felt strange. The ceiling was cracked, the walls were damp, and the air was heavy and cold. Somewhere outside, the wind rustled, but it sounded wrong, like someone whispering. George was sitting nearby. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were wide open, staring into the dark. "George, what's wrong?" Peppa asked. He silently pointed toward the door. A dim light flickered in the hallway. Peppa carefully climbed down from her bed and followed her brother. The house was empty. There were no smells of Mummy Pig's cooking. The TV in the living room was off, and beyond the windows there was no garden, only endless fog. They walked slowly. The floorboards creaked under their feet and water dripped from the ceiling. When Peppa opened the bathroom door, she froze. Where the mirror used to hang, there was now a door, narrow, blue, as if painted right onto the tiles. "It wasn't here before," Peppa whispered. George stepped closer, reached out his little hoof, and touched the handle. The door opened. No creak, no sound. Just silently swung inward into a thick blue darkness. A cold draft came from within. George stepped through without looking back. The door closed behind him. Peppa was left alone. She knocked, called his name, but there was no answer. A few minutes later, the door opened again. George came out, covered in dust, as if he'd been somewhere ancient. His eyes looked empty. "Where were you?" Peppa asked. He whispered, "There, blue rooms." And a shadow. It's waiting Peppa didn't understand. George went to bed, but all night he tossed and turned, mumbling in his sleep. The next night, it happened again. The blue door appeared once more, and again, only George could open it. Peppa tried to grab his hoof, but her touch passed through the air, as though the door existed only for him. When he returned, his fur was no longer dusty but covered in soot. His eyes glowed faintly with an eerie light. He didn't want to talk. "Only sometimes," he whispered. "Labubu is inside." He's watching. Peppa began to notice strange things. The shadows in the corners of the room started to move on their own. The water in the sink looked dark, like a mirror. When she called George, he turned his head slowly, as if unsure who was speaking to him. "George, it's me, your sister," she said quietly. One night, Peppa woke up to the sound of footsteps. George was standing by her bed. His eyes shone with a cold blue light. In them, Peppa saw not their room, but a reflection of rippling water, as if inside his gaze was a river. In that murky water, shapes were moving. Peppa gasped. George smiled, but it wasn't his smile. "He's calling," he whispered. "He wants you to come too." Peppa ran to the bathroom. The blue door was there again, glowing faintly, as if lit from within. Moist air flowed from it, and on the floor shimmered a trembling reflection, like the surface of water. She didn't go closer. She knew if she opened it, she wouldn't come back. The next morning, the door was gone. Only a damp wall remained, and a dark hoofprint mark on the floor. George sat on his bed, calm, as if nothing had happened. "Where were you?" she asked. He smiled. "I'm already home." But when Peppa looked into his eyes, she thought she saw movement behind the reflection of the room, a blue shadow shaped like Labubu, sliding across his pupil before vanishing. Since then, Peppa has never seen the blue door again, but every night, when the house grows too quiet, somewhere deep within the walls, there comes a soft sound, as if someone is turning a blue handle once more. It all began with something small. Peppa woke up in her room and saw the sun shining through the window just like always. George was asleep beside her, lying on his side, hugging his dinosaur. Everything seemed ordinary. From downstairs came the familiar sounds. Mummy Pig making breakfast, Daddy Pig rustling his newspaper. Peppa went down, and on the table a bowl of porridge was waiting for her. But the porridge was cold. She tasted it. It had no flavor at all, no sweetness, no salt, just emptiness. Peppa frowned but said nothing. The day passed as usual. A walk in the garden, lunch, games with George, a bedtime story, and then sleep again. The next morning, everything repeated. George lay in the same position. Mummy cooked the same breakfast. Daddy held the newspaper in the same way. And again, the porridge was cold. Peppa thought it was déjà vu, but by the third day, it was clear. This was no coincidence. George said the same word, dinosaur. Her parents repeated the same phrases. The sun fell at the same angle, and everything followed the same script. On the fourth day, Peppa decided to test it. She didn't go down for breakfast, staying in her room instead. But nothing changed. Downstairs, the same voices continued. George said the same things. Her parents didn't notice her absence, as if it had already been written that way. "Mummy," Peppa asked cautiously, "what day is it today?" Mummy Pig looked at her and smiled, too wide. "Today is today." The words sounded hollow, like an echo. Time lost all meaning. Day after day, nothing changed. Only Peppa felt the growing unease. The walls began to seem alive. The windows glowed with a flat white light, as though they weren't showing the outside world at all but painted scenery. Doors led to the same rooms but at wrong angles, as if the house was folding and unfolding on itself. On the seventh day, Peppa woke up earlier than everyone else, or so it seemed. The room was dark, though the clock said it was morning. George lay beside her, his eyes wide open. He didn't blink, he didn't breathe. But when Peppa called his name, he suddenly sat up, smiled too quickly, too perfectly, and said, "Today will be a good day, Peppa." And then he froze again. Fear gripped her. She hid under the blanket, but deep down she knew this wasn't her home anymore. Soon Daddy Pig vanished. His place at the table was empty, though the newspaper still lay on the chair. Then Mummy disappeared. Then George. No one noticed their absence. It was as if they had never existed. Only Peppa remembered. On the final day, she gathered her courage and stepped outside. What met her wasn't the world. The grass was painted flat on the ground. The trees were cardboard cutouts. The sky was nothing but a dull grey light without sun or clouds. It all looked like a stage set. And then she heard it. A monotonous, distorted melody, like something played on a broken record. From around the corner of the house came Tralalelo Tralala. His movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. His red eyes glowed in the half-light. His mouth opened and closed, and each time that same strange tune spilled out. Tralalelo, tralala. The sound echoed through the empty world, bouncing off the walls of her mind. Peppa tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as if her feet were fused to the ground. Her thoughts grew heavy, blurred. The world around her shook, its lines smeared like wet paint. Then, among the cardboard trees, a figure appeared. Dancing, laughter pierced the grey sky, louder, sharper. It was Lirili Larilla. Her movements were graceful, spinning as if she was enjoying the nightmare. Her form broke apart into fragments, then reassembled, as if she didn't belong to this world at all. Peppa stood alone. The house behind her no longer looked like a home, but like another piece of scenery. The creatures closed in. Tralalelo Tralala stepped closer, his glowing red eyes burning brighter. Lirili Larilla's laughter rose, her silhouette trembling, about to reach out for Peppa herself. And at that moment, Peppa understood. This wasn't a dream, not déjà vu, not repetition. It was a game, their game, and she was next. Peppa opened her eyes in the middle of the night and immediately realized something had changed. Their cozy room looked unfamiliar. The wallpaper was peeling, the ceiling was cracked, and toys were scattered in the dust. George had also woken up and sat on his bed, sobbing softly. "Peppa, this isn't our house. he whispered, clutching his dinosaur. The silence was so thick it rang in their ears. And then it broke. In the living room, the television hummed to life. They both knew no one had turned it on. The screen flickered with static, distorting the darkness of the room. Peppa carefully led her brother by the paw downstairs. The living room looked even worse. The floor was stained with damp spots. The furniture creaked as if it had been standing for hundreds of years. Jagged lines and blurry silhouettes danced across the screen. "Mummy? Daddy?" Peppa called, but only a distorted, heavy voice replied, "You have been happy for too long. Now it's time to pay." George clapped his hands over his ears in horror, while Peppa stepped closer. Two glowing spots appeared on the screen. One cold blue, the other warm orange. From these patches of light, shapes began to take form. Their bodies looked as though they were built from blocks, their faces stretched into unnatural smiles. "It's Los Bros," Peppa whispered. "We've come," they said in unison. Their voices sounded as if they came from both the television and directly inside her head. At that moment, Peppa noticed the mirror on the wall. She looked into it and froze. Staring back at her was herself, but twisted. Her eyes were enormous and black, her mouth stretched into a wide grin, and behind her reflection stood two figures, one blue, one orange. Peppa screamed. George, terrified, ran toward the door and suddenly vanished. His cry echoed through the empty house before silence fell again. "George!" Peppa shouted. She dashed through the rooms, opening every door, but their house was no longer a home. Corridors stretched endlessly, windows looked out into black emptiness. On the floor lay George's dinosaur. The toy was dirty, marked with strange stains, blue and orange prints, as though someone had gripped it with both hands. Peppa's heart pounded. She picked up the toy and heard laughter. It came from everywhere at once, from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath her. The laughter was childlike and cheerful, yet there was something tortured within it. The television flared again, and now the figures of Los Bros appeared clearly. On the left stood Tralalerit, his aura glowing blue, eyes burning with a cold gleam. His grin was so wide it seemed it might tear his face apart. On the right stood Tung 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 Sito, bathed in orange light. His movements were sharp, his stare piercing, as if he could see straight through her soul. "Where's George?" Peppa cried, though her voice trembled. "He's with us," one answered. "Now it's your turn," added the other. A stream of black smoke burst from the television. It whirled into a vortex, and the entire house began to change. The floor cracked, the walls bent and warped, the ceiling sank lower. Peppa tried to run, but her legs felt as heavy as stone. The shadows on the walls came alive, stretching into hands that clawed at her dress. She tore herself free, but standing before her now were Los Bros themselves. No longer on the screen, but in the room. Their blocky bodies seemed alive, yet their eyes were alien. Blue and orange light intertwined, wrapping around everything. Peppa felt her breathing grow heavier, her heart tighten in her chest. "We will play," they said in unison. "Forever." They stepped closer. The floor beneath her feet vanished, and Peppa fell into a crimson void. The last thing she saw were their faces grinning in the darkness, and their hands reaching out to her. And then the house sank into silence. Only in the forest, near their home, one can sometimes hear children's laughter and a faint whisper carrying two voices, one blue, one orange. Late at night, Peppa and George were still awake. They sat on the floor of their bedroom, building a tower out of blocks and laughing. Outside stretched the darkness, the wind rustling through the branches of the trees. But suddenly the room grew colder. At first, just a faint draft, then an icy current of air that made the toys on the shelves begin to sway. "Peppa," "I'm scared," George whispered. The toys began to move. Cars rolled across the floor on their own. The teddy bear lifted its paw, and a doll tilted its head so sharply that its neck cracked. Peppa pulled her brother close and felt the walls begin to change. The drawings on the wallpaper came alive. Flowers stretched into black, writhing lines like shadows, creeping slowly upward. The bedroom door creaked and swung open. A silhouette appeared on the threshold. It looked like Daddy Pig, but twisted, like a reflection in a warped mirror. His body was covered with green growths, like avocados, and his arms were massive and powerful, like those of a gorilla. His eyes glowed a dim red. This was the avocado gorilla. He leaned forward and spoke in a deep voice. "Let's play a game. Stay absolutely still until morning. Any movement, and you lose." Peppa and George froze where they were. In the corridor behind him appeared the figures of Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig. But they were not their parents. Their faces were lifeless, their smiles too wide, and their eyes were empty, black voids. They stood motionless, staring directly at the children. The house began to distort. The ceiling rose higher, the walls stretched, and new doors appeared. Doors that had never been there before. One opened on its own, revealing only fog and the sound of heavy footsteps. The air grew thick and cold, and the lamp overhead flickered as if it were breathing in rhythm with Peppa's heart. "I can see you," the avocado gorilla said, his voice echoing as if from inside the house itself. "Whether you stand still, whether you breathe too loudly, I will notice." George gripped his sister's hand so tightly, Peppa's fingers turned white. She didn't dare move. It seemed the shadows on the walls were watching them, waiting to catch even the slightest twitch. Minutes dragged on endlessly. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind sounded like thunder. Time itself felt frozen. Peppa knew that if she flinched even once, the game would end, and the end would be terrible. When the clock hands finally crept past dawn, the figures began to fade. The avocado gorilla slowly dissolved like smoke. The shadows sank back into the walls, and the drawings on the wallpaper turned ordinary again. The room returned to normal, but Peppa and George knew it hadn't been a dream. It was a test. The next morning, their parents acted as if nothing had happened. Mummy made breakfast. Daddy read his paper. Peppa wanted to ask about the night, but stayed silent. They remembered nothing. Or maybe they simply didn't want to. A day later, the family went to Grandpa Pig's farm. Peppa was excited about the trip, but unease gnawed at her. From the very moment they approached, she noticed everything was different. The trees seemed taller than before, their branches weaving into a heavy canopy. The ground was soft, almost damp, and every step released the smell of rot. The farm was silent. The usual chatter of animals was gone. The barn was empty. The shed stood open, but inside there wasn't a sound. Even the ducks on the pond sat motionless, like statues. Grandpa Pig greeted them with a smile, but his eyes were strange. In them glowed the same red light Peppa had seen in the avocado gorilla. "Welcome," he said. "Today we'll play a game too." The family stood in the middle of the yard, surrounded by fog. The houses and trees around the farm seemed to blend together into one vast living creature. Peppa felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, and in that trembling she heard the familiar breathing of the avocado gorilla. She squeezed George's hand and realized the game was not over. Their home, their farm, their world, it had already changed. The avocado gorilla was watching them, and now he was everywhere. An ordinary day in Peppa Pig's house passed quietly and almost unnoticed. But Peppa herself immediately noticed. Her little brother George was different. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't running around the house like he usually did. Even his favorite dinosaur lay forgotten in the corner, unwanted. George sat by the window, staring into the grey sky, silent. His eyes seemed empty, as if he wasn't looking at anything at all but falling into a bottomless void. "George?" Peppa asked carefully. "Are you all right?" But he didn't answer. He only slowly turned his head to his sister and gave her a faint smile. That smile wasn't warm. It had no joy, no trace of his usual childish innocence. A chill ran down Peppa's spine. At dinner that evening, he barely ate. Their parents tried to talk, but George replied only in single words, or not at all. Peppa noticed that Mummy and Daddy seemed not to see anything strange. They behaved as if George had always been this quiet and distant. Days passed. Each time Peppa found her brother, he was in a different place, out in the garden, by the window, in the hallway, and every time he just sat there, unmoving, as if waiting for something. His eyes grew emptier with each passing day. Peppa tried to play with him, but he never reacted. Sometimes she caught his stare, long, unblinking, foreign. And then, one evening, Peppa noticed George quietly rise and walk to the door. His steps were slow and steady, as though he knew exactly where he was going. "George, wait!" Peppa called, but he didn't turn back. She ran after him. Outside, drizzle filled the air, cold and heavy. George walked straight toward the forest behind their house. Peppa's heart pounded in her chest faster and faster, but she couldn't stop herself. Curiosity and fear pushed her forward. Deep in the woods stood an old hut. Peppa had never seen it before, even though she'd played in these woods many times. The door hung half open and cold air seeped out. George stepped inside, and after a brief hesitation, Peppa followed him. Inside, it was dark, smelling of dust and mold. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet. George stood in the center of the room. Slowly, he turned toward her. His eyes were utterly lifeless, like two bottomless pits. A wide, unnatural smile was frozen on his face. "I'm not George anymore," he whispered. His voice was low, hollow, as if it belonged to someone else. Peppa's knees went weak. She stumbled backward, but George melted into the darkness, vanishing as if he had never been there. The room filled with silence, so heavy that her ears rang. Terrified, Peppa ran out of the hut, tripping and stumbling until she reached home. She burst into the hallway, gasping for air, her heart hammering. But when she looked into George's room, she froze. He was there, sitting on the floor, playing with his blocks, as if nothing had happened. He was even humming a soft tune. "George," Peppa whispered. He lifted his head. His eyes were just as empty, his smile just as dreadful. That night, Peppa tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. She listened to every sound in the house, and then she heard it. First a faint rustle, then a quiet scraping. It was coming from under her bed. Peppa slowly leaned over and peeked beneath. There sat Labubu, her favorite toy. But now, he didn't look the same. His eyes glowed red in the darkness, reflecting the dim light from the window. His smile was stretched far too wide, so distorted it looked as though the fabric of his face had split apart. In his tiny hands, Labubu held a figure. Peppa's heart stopped when she recognized it. It was George, a small, pale copy of her brother with empty eyes and lifeless skin. Labubu raised the figure to his face. His glowing eyes flared brighter, and his smile twisted into something almost inhuman. "He is mine now," he whispered in a low, alien voice. Peppa recoiled, clutching her blanket, squeezing her eyes shut. She prayed it was only a dream. But when she opened them again, Labubu was still there. In his hands, the figure of George remained. Peppa understood. It was him. It was Labubu who had changed George. He had stolen his soul, and now he wouldn't stop. George was only the beginning. The house grew quiet, too quiet. Even her parents in recent days seemed to have forgotten their younger child. When Peppa asked about him, they only gave her long, blank looks and replied, "We've only ever had you." And in that moment, Peppa realized the most terrible truth. Labubu hadn't just taken George. He had begun erasing him. He was sinking deeper and deeper into their house, into their family, into reality itself. And at night, sitting on the shelf in Peppa's room, Labubu smiled faintly. His red eyes glowed dimly in the darkness, and Peppa knew soon he would come for her too. Morning in Peppa Pig's house began differently than usual. She opened her eyes and immediately felt something was wrong. The room looked familiar, but the air was heavy, pressing, filled with a suffocating silence. George lay beside her, hugging his dinosaur, but she couldn't even hear his breathing. Peppa carefully got up and went downstairs. Normally, at this time, Mummy Pig would be making breakfast, and the house would be filled with the smell of porridge. But now, a different smell greeted her. Cold, empty, like a room where no one had lived for a very long time. Her family was waiting in the living room. Mummy, Daddy, and George sat on the sofa. They didn't move, they didn't speak. Their eyes were completely empty, like two black ovals, without reflection, without life. On their faces was the same wide, identical smile. They turned their heads toward Peppa all at once, and there was nothing natural in that movement. Peppa took a step back, and at that moment the television turned on by itself. The screen flickered, showed static, and then her reflection. Only it wasn't hers. The face on the screen was distorted, the eyes too big, the mouth twisted, and most terrifying of all, it didn't move the way she did. When Peppa blinked, the reflection kept staring with wide, unblinking eyes. When she raised her hoof, her copy did the same, but with a delay and at a strange angle, like a puppet pulled on strings. Sound filled the room. It wasn't a voice, and it wasn't music. It was a jumble of distorted phrases, spoken backwards. They overlapped, merging into a droning noise that made her ears ache. Peppa covered them with her hooves, but the sound continued inside her head. Her family stood up from the sofa and took a step forward. Their movements were synchronized, which made it even more terrifying. Peppa ran upstairs into her room and slammed the door shut. But the mirror in her bedroom was already waiting for her. Inside was the same copy from the screen. It was moving faster now, scratching at the glass with its hooves from the inside. Cracks spread across the surface, and its lips began to move. At first, silently. Then, through the crackling, she heard words, backwards and barely recognizable. "Let me in." The mirror splintered. In panic, Peppa pulled back, clutching the doorknob. And at that instant, everything fell silent again. The silence was thick, buzzing. She slowly went downstairs. The kitchen greeted her with a new, horrifying sight. Sitting right on the table was Labubu. Her favorite toy had always seemed harmless, but now it looked different. Its eyes were hollow, black, and its smile stretched too wide, as if the fabric of its face was ready to rip apart. In Labubu's paws was George's torn dinosaur. Threads hung from it, and the plastic body was twisted into an unnatural pose. Peppa froze, unable to move. Labubu slowly lifted its head. Its mouth didn't move, but a long hissing sound came from within. Then it stretched its tiny paw toward Peppa. Fear paralyzed her. She felt she couldn't scream, couldn't run. Labubu tilted its head slightly, as if saying, "You knew it would come to this." She felt the walls of the house begin to tremble. Lights flickered on in the corridor by themselves. Shadows stretched across the walls, too long, moving as if they were copying her every gesture. The television turned on again, and this time the distorted Peppa didn't just appear on the screen. It began to crawl halfway out. Its lips stretched into a grin, and it winked. Peppa covered her face with her hooves. She understood this day would not end. It would repeat again and again. And Labubu, sitting on the table, was there to make sure of it. His eyes glowed red, his smile stretched even wider. He was waiting.